You guys want to hear something terrifying? The prophecy of the popes.
Oh boy.
This book in the Vatican archives predicted every single pope from 1143 all the way to our current pope. But the scary thing is, after Pope Francis, the last one, it just says Judgment Day.
Oh gosh.
It literally ends after Pope Francis?
Yes. The creepiest thing, inside St. Paul's Basilica, bordering the whole inner sanctuary, is a picture of every single pope. But what's weird is that there's only a certain amount of markers where you can put a picture. There's one left after Pope Francis. They have always said once that last slot is filled, it'll be the end of the world. What he predicted, the time it took to go from the first pope that he wrote about to the halfway mark was 422 years. And he's saying from the middle one to the end, another 422 years will be the end of the world. If you do 422 in the middle pope, which was 1585, that year is 2027.
Dang!
It's even weirder. Pope John the 23rd, he said that the end of the world would happen 2,000 years plus Christ's life. So that adds up to 2027 as well.
Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the PodCatechist. My name is Baylor Griffin. Very glad to have you here joining me. Thank you for being here. The goal of this podcast is to re-catechize the West. And what do I mean by that? Well, catechize, that's just a Christian word that means to teach. And we've all been taught various anti-Christian things that we have assumed as part of our worldview, and we may not even realize that they are anti-Christian. So the goal of the podcast here is to help people think and live more Christianly, re-catechize the West. By the way, this show is a production of New Catechist Press, so make sure you visit newcatechistpress.com to find more resources like this. Now, on with the show. I'll go ahead and say on the front end that my hope today is that if you are experiencing what we might occasionally be able to call end times anxiety, I want to ease that for you a little bit. So just for some context here, the clip that I played in the beginning is from the Ninjas Are Butterflies guys. And I'll say that I'm actually a fan. I like those guys a lot. Their content is a lot of fun. And as I say things to kind of refute the video, okay, the last thing that I want you to take away from that is that I think these guys are dumb or that I don't like them or something, because I actually love their content. It's really fun. But this is one of those areas where I think it's important to interject with some biblical thinking, some thinking Christianly about this issue, and bring some clarity to it. So since the death of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo XIV, there's been a pretty constant barrage of sermon clips, shorts, reels, TikToks, other online content speculating if the death of Pope Francis is a sign of the end times somehow. And there's a lot of videos of this, like a lot, and they're not fringe. They're insanely popular. These videos are getting millions of views, tens of thousands of likes, and they frankly, I think, have a lot of people worried and asking questions about the end times. And if I'm quite honest with you, this comes up a couple times a year, just depending on the event. I mean, if you remember, I remember back in, it was last year, actually. It was April of last year when an eclipse was going to come over America, and people were saying that the path of the eclipse lined up with a lot of cities that had biblical names, and so they were drawing all kinds of end times conclusions from that. And I remember at the time, like, people that I really loved and really cared about were messaging me, sending me clips where people were explaining this and saying that the eclipse was a sign of the end times. And we were actually in labor when this was happening. When the eclipse hit America, we were at the hospital having a baby. And we were actually hoping that Juniper would be born the day of the eclipse, but and we were even walking around and things like this outside. We got to see the eclipse in the kind of like garden area outside at the hospital because labor was not progressing the way we wanted it to, and it was a very long labor. She ended up being born the next day, so she just missed the cutoff on being born on the day of the eclipse, which we were kind of bummed, but happy that she was born. I should clarify, but very, very happy that she was born. But I remember being in the hospital and people sending me messages online on Facebook and on Instagram and texting me, sending me clips like, hey, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is a sign of the end times? And I just remember a lot of anxiety around that people had. And then it happened again when Hamas attacked Israel last year in October. And people were saying that was a sign of the end times. And so all of that to say, this happens a couple times a year where people see a world event. They see something in the headlines. Some preachers have called this newspaper exegesis, where we see events happening in the world and we start playing, pinned the end times verse on the newspaper. I want to hopefully address that a little bit and help us think a little bit more Christianly about this. I want to approach this from two directions. The first is more of a biblical direction, okay? God's word is our highest and final authority on all matters of faith and practice. And that includes eschatology. Eschatology, if you're not familiar, is just the study of the end times, okay? You simply can't make a case from Scripture that the amount of picture frames in the Vatican has anything to do with when Christ will return, okay? You just can't make that case. So that's the first thing. From a biblical worldview perspective, all of this is just extra biblical speculation. Extra biblical meaning outside the Bible, and then speculation. They're just making stuff up. We really don't know if that has anything to do with anything because the Bible is silent on it. So thinking Christianly about this sort of thing means not letting extra biblical speculation occupy your mind and emotions. There's nothing of biblical substance to this. And so there should be no real time or emotional investment or anything like this put into these kinds of theories. But the second thing I'll say is that end times extra biblical speculation or date setting, right? For example, so they did some date setting there. What do I mean by date setting? They said the year 2027, that's when Christ will return, or that's when the judgment is, that's the end of the world, whatever. That's date setting. You're predicting a day when Jesus will come back, when the judgment's going to happen. Date setting and speculation, other speculation could be who is the Antichrist, who's going to arise, all of this kind of stuff. This has been going on. This kind of speculation and date setting has been going on pretty much nonstop for the entire 2,000 years of Christianity. When you understand that, that this kind of speculation and the conspiracy theorist guy with all of the red yarn and the marker and like looking crazy in the eyes, that kind of activity has been going on in various sects of the church for 2,000 years, it puts some things into perspective. And it kind of makes a lot of this Pope Francis, Pope Leo XIV stuff seem a little silly. Remember, one of the things that I've talked about on the podcast is that we tend to be stranded in the present. We don't know our history. We're not interested in knowing our history a lot of the time even. And one of the downfalls to being stranded in the present is that you end up making a lot of kind of logical mistakes. You begin to think that all of the chess pieces are falling into place, and this is the first time that all of the chess pieces are in the right place in history. But you're wrong. You could make a case at any point in history that Jesus could return in your generation. And in fact, that's what people have done. And we'll get to some historical examples of end times date setting here in a minute. But my point in bringing them up is that if you actually look at these instances in history when people thought that they were living in the last generation, I actually think there were multiple moments when their case was stronger than our case would be. So let's look at a few examples here. By the way, there's a great book on this, which I got a lot of this data from, called The Day and the Hour by Francis Gumerlock, I think is how you say his last name, Gumerlock, Francis Gumerlock. The full title of the book is The Day and the Hour, A Chronicle of Christianity's Perennial Fascination with Predicting the End of the World. It's just a great title. Anyway, what Gumerlock does in his book is just kind of list out all of these instances in which someone did this, where they looked at the world around them and started making predictions and date setting, saying, oh, Jesus is going to come back in 45 years or whatever. Really fascinating stuff. And I'll also mention that there's a fella by the name of Gregg Strawbridge. He's passed away a couple years ago unexpectedly, but he founded something called Word MP3, and some of his work as well was really instrumental in helping me pull this podcast episode together. But pulling from them, I'm going to give you a couple examples of when in history people thought that it was the last days. They thought it was the end times, and they had all sorts of newspaper headlines that they could use as evidence. In about the year 200, there was a bishop in Syria that told his congregation that they needed to evacuate to a desert area, and he predicted that the last judgment would take place within 1 year. This was in 200 AD. All right? And here's the kicker, and this will become important later. He said, if what I tell you does not come to pass, have no more faith in the scriptures and do as you please. Can you believe that? He literally said, I predict that the end of the world will be 1 year from now, and if I'm wrong, the Bible's wrong. That's crazy. Well, he was wrong, but praise be to God that the Bible is still right. That's what he's told his followers, though, and that's nonsense. Next one I'll mention is Cyril of Jerusalem. I don't know if I'm saying his name properly. Cyril, Ceryl. I know a little bit about Cyril of Jerusalem, but I've only ever read his name. I've never actually said it out loud until this moment, so I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. In the 300s, he believed that when Rome fell, that would be the great falling away, and that the Antichrist would arise, and that would be the end of the world. Wrong. The empire is fallen. Tragically, some might add. And we're all still here. A man by the name of Donatus was also around in the 300s. This is 300 AD, guys. You might know his name for different reasons. You know, there was a bit of kind of a puritanical thing going on with Donatus versus St. Augustine. But we'll save that conversation for another day. Augustine was right. But he believed that his followers were the chosen 144,000 that are named in the book of Revelation. And he believed that the Antichrist was alive in his day and was just waiting to reveal himself. It was 300 AD. And we're still here. Now, fast forward a little bit. Let me give you, this end times speculation Islam edition. So the Muslims conquer Jerusalem and take it over. And of course, they build a mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And the bishop of Jerusalem at the time, Sophronius, I think is how you say his name. Sophronius, maybe, something like that. Anyway, at the time, he said that this mosque on the Temple Mount was the abomination of desolation, talked about in Daniel and in passages like Matthew 24, and that this meant that the end was near and in their generation. And there were others who taught that the Islamic forces were the Gog and Magog mentioned in the book of Revelation. And now say it with me. All together, we're still here. Okay? I can keep going. In the 700s through the 11th century, it was very common for Christians in Europe to interpret Viking raids as a sign of the end times, even comparing it to like the Horsemen of the Apocalypse kind of situation. The Crusaders also believed that they were carrying out end times prophecy. Pope Urban, who gave the sermon that called for the First Crusade, believed that the Crusades would usher in a new Christian era in Jerusalem, specifically, and that they must carry this out so that when the Antichrist arose in Jerusalem, there would be enough Christians there for the Antichrist to actually fight. Okay? Just a couple more here. I'm hoping you're getting the picture. The Franciscan order, Saint Francis of Assisi. Many of his followers believed that the Franciscan order was the 144,000 that would renew the end times church. But this 144,000 thing, it's going to keep coming up. It's crazy. Now's a good time to bring in the Reformation. Let me pull that up real quick. I got to find that. It's back here somewhere. Yeah, Reformation. Let's talk Reformation. Because the Reformation era is really, really interesting on this. For example, not every reformer really went crazy with this. A lot of them were like not into the whole, and they didn't really talk about it. A lot of them just didn't even talk about it. But you got to think at the time of the Reformation, the church had been largely apostate. for several centuries. Not as long as people think, but at least, indulgences, I think they started selling indulgences in the 11th century. Okay, so fast forward to the 1400s and 1500s, when you've got like Wycliffe and John Huss, and then eventually you have Luther coming on the scene. The church had been apostate for several centuries in a lot of ways, and the gospel had been pretty much lost. Priests were mostly getting up and quoting like Greek philosophers. They weren't teaching scripture. They weren't teaching the truth of the Bible. They were selling indulgences, which is a very wicked practice. No one had access to the scriptures in their own language anymore. That had gone by the wayside. And so, obviously, like I said earlier, when you have guys like Wycliffe and John Huss come up and they speak out against this corruption in the church and the suppression of the gospel, and trying to get the scriptures back into the hands of the people in their own language, what happened to them? They were executed. They were burned. They had their limbs cut off. I believe it was Wycliffe who they hated him so much that after they executed him, they dug up his body and burned it again. Like that, they hated that guy. And for what? For wanting to get the Bible into people's hands. That's crazy. And who was doing the persecuting? Let's think about this. Who was doing the persecuting? The Pope. The man who was supposed to be Christ's vicar on earth, the head of the church on earth, was the one suppressing the gospel, suppressing the spread of the scriptures, suppressing the truth, and persecuting those who are preaching the truth and preaching the gospel. And so it's no wonder that by the time of the Reformation in the 1500s and 1600s, the widespread belief amongst Protestant reformers was that the Pope was the Antichrist and that it was the end times. Because what do you have? You have, for several centuries now, a great falling away, a loss of access to the gospel, a loss of access to the scriptures, and the man who's supposed to be representing Christ on earth, according to Roman Catholic ecclesiology, what is he doing? He is actively suppressing the gospel and making martyrs out of the men who are preaching the truth. And so what is that? It's very clear to them at that time that they're living in the last days and that the Pope is the Antichrist. In fact, they actually codified this in the Westminster Confession of Faith. In the Westminster Confession, it says the Pope is the Antichrist, okay? That was the 1600s. And 400 plus ish years later, we're still here. The gospel has actually gone out to places it had never been yet in the 1600s. So since that time, the church in a lot of ways has grown and is thriving. So they were wrong. It was not the last generation. The Pope was not the Antichrist, although the Pope was wrong and anti-Christ, anti-Christian in that way. But here's what I'm trying to say. There's two instances that I've named here, right? You've got the Muslims coming in and setting up an abomination of desolation in Jerusalem. It's very easy at that time to think, this is obviously the abomination of desolation. This is obviously the end times. And they were wrong. But I think that their case was stronger than our case would be if we were to take, some priest wrote a book about the popes, and he said that after Pope Francis would be the last one, and then there's not enough picture frame spaces in the Vatican. This must be the end. And that's nowhere near as good of a case as the Bishop of Jerusalem had after the Islamic conquest. He had a better case. So did the reformers. They had a better case. There really was a great falling away, and that falling away was great, and things were dark, and there was this figure who how could you get around this guy being the Antichrist? Of course he's the Antichrist. It's obvious if you are living in that day as a Protestant reformer. And guess what? They were wrong. Their case is better than our case. They were wrong. What does that say about us? That's what I'm trying to say. And hopefully by saying all this, I'm easing some of your anxiety. That was my goal, was as we go through these historical accounts, by the end of it, you think, okay, The next time an eclipse happens, the next time a pope dies and a new one comes on the scene, we don't have to freak out. It may get a lot of views. It may be very popular to speculate about the end times. That's one of the easiest ways to get clicks on the planet. My issue with it is several things. One, I mean, it causes a lot of Christians anxiety about this thing. And two, it distracts us. It really does. We should not be devoting a ton of energy to this. But then, obviously, most importantly, maybe even, is that there's a measure to which atheists love when we do this. Atheists love when we predict the future and are wrong. Of course they do, right? And so it doesn't help our testimony to waste time on these sorts of things. Now, I'll just give you a couple more examples that kind of get us closer to modern times, and then we'll be done with this. In the 1800s, you get the development of a lot of wild eschatologies and even some cults around this. And so if you look at Mormonism, Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, there's other examples like Shakers and folks like this who develop these crazy eschatologies and even cultish practices around it. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe, again, that they're the 144,000. Everybody thinks they're the 144,000. It's just ridiculous. Completely missing the point of what the 144,000 was intended to communicate, if you ask me. And then, of course, I have to mention dispensationalism. Now, I know that this has the potential to upset a lot of people, and a lot of people that I genuinely love, but dispensationalism comes on the scene through guys like Darby and Clarence Larkin. I actually have a copy of Clarence Larkin's full dispensations collection down here on my bookshelf. And all of this was also really popularized by the Scofield Bible, the Scofield Reference Bible that had explanatory notes inside of the Bible, and all of the explanations took a dispensational point of view. And so a lot of people bought this Bible and bought into dispensationalism, even if they didn't even know what dispensationalism was. They're just kind of, it gets absorbed into American church culture. But the dispensational end times framework of a pre-tribulational rapture, a 7-day tribulation, or 7-year tribulation afterwards, and then is the second coming of Christ, and then a millennial reign, but people are still dying in the millennium, and all of this has a tendency towards speculation. It's very easy to go from the dispensational worldview and dispensational interpretation of Scripture and walk straight to the newspaper headlines and start drawing conclusions. So a good example of this is a dispensational guy by the name of Edgar Wisnant famously wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. And his argument was largely based on the fact that in 1948, Israel became a nation again in the Middle East. He took a passage in Matthew 24 about this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. He took this generation to be the generation that sees these things happening. A generation in Bible terms would be about 40 years. And so he predicted that in 1988, Christ would return. He sold like millions and millions and millions of copies of this. Like, people bought it. In a debate, I think it was Wisnant. It was either Wisnant or Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey was also making predictions that the 80s would probably be the last decade before the return of Christ. And it was one of those two guys, if I remember correctly, who in a debate with someone over this issue said, if I'm wrong, the Bible's wrong. It's almost exactly what that cult leader guy said in the 200s. If I'm wrong, the Bible's wrong. That's crazy. You don't say stuff like that. So here's the point. I know this is a longer episode than usual, but the reason why I did all of this is because I'm hoping that with some historical perspective and a simple reminder that I gave you in the beginning, that this is all just extra biblical speculation, that the Bible is our highest authority, and the Bible doesn't say anything about how many paintings are hanging in the Vatican. Hopefully, that means that the next time you see these kind of sensationalist videos decrying that it is the end times, hopefully you can ignore it. You can just ignore the end times madness that has been popping up its ugly head off and on for 2,000 straight years. Now, of course, do I believe in the second coming of Christ? Yes, absolutely. Do I believe in the resurrection of the body? Yes, absolutely. Of course I do. Now, maybe we can get into, my exact eschatological position some other time. What do I think the scriptures actually say about what's going to happen between the ascension of Christ and his second coming? We can get into that some other time. But the important thing for today is this: you can ignore the end times madness. All right, we come to the Catechism portion of the show where we're working on Spurgeon's A Puritan Catechism together, and we're on question 21. What office does Christ execute as Redeemer? And this is the answer. Christ, as our Redeemer, executes the offices of a prophet, of a priest, and of a king, both in his state of humiliation and exaltation. Wonderful, wonderful answer there. Let's look at the verses cited just real quick. Acts 3:22 says, "For Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you." Spurgeon also cites Hebrews 5:6, as he saith also in another place, "Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." So obviously the first verse is about Jesus being a prophet. The next verse is about Jesus being the priest. And this is the last one, Psalm 2:6. "Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion." That is talking about Jesus, who is our king. So what this catechism question makes reference to is what theologians have called the threefold office of Christ: prophet, priest, king. Now in the Old Testament, all of these offices were separate. The office of the prophet, the one who declares the word of the Lord to the people. That was one thing executed by one particular person or one particular group of people. And then you have the office of the priesthood, executed by the Levitical order, the Levitical priesthood. That's another group of people. And then there was, of course, the king, and under him the civil government that he ran. And so that's a separate thing as well, executed by another person and another group of people. So this, in principle, is how God set it up in the Old Testament. Now, of course, in special cases, those lines occasionally get blurred. For example, in the book of Acts, David is referred to as a prophet because he was the writer of most of the Psalms. But generally speaking, in principle, you had a separation of powers in the Old Testament. Even in David's time, he was the king. The Levitical priesthood was in David's tabernacle doing their thing before the Ark of the Covenant. And then, when David sins, we see the entrance of a prophet, Nathan, who comes to rebuke the king by the word of the Lord when the king sinned. So you've got the idea of the separation of powers there. And I think one of the things that makes that so wise on the part of the Lord to do it that way is because I think the Lord knew, obviously, he was working with sinful people. And if you take all of these three offices and wrap them up in one sinful person, what you have on your hands is a tyrant. That's what you have, because that's a sinner. And so there was a separation of these offices in the Old Testament, which, for what it's worth, is where Western civilization got the idea of a separation of powers that check one another. That's where that came from. That it came from Deuteronomy, okay? But that's for another day. So there's a separation of these offices in the Old Testament, but when Christ comes, he is sinless. And through his life, his atoning death and burial, his resurrection and ascension and rule today, he fulfills the Old Testament law, and he assumes all of these offices in himself. Prophet, priest, and king. They are all fulfilled and assumed in the sinless person and work of Jesus Christ. And that means, as our Redeemer, he has the power and authority to redeem us in all areas of life. All areas of life. Which brings us back to this saying that I've grown incredibly fond of, which is all of Christ for all of life. That's what we want. We want all of him. We want all of his kingdom, all of his power, all of his law, all of his authority, all of his grace, all of his redemption, and we want it in every single area and aspect of our lives, no exceptions. Now, the following catechism questions zoom in on each of these, so we'll look more closely at Christ as priest. We'll look more closely at Christ as prophet, and then, of course, we'll look more closely at Christ as King, each individually, and what the implications are for us and for the world. But for now, I just want to remind you about this book that I think I still have it on my shelf. All right, I just want to remind you about this book that deals with this topic specifically by Jonty Rhodes. It's called Man of Sorrows, King of Glory. This is a whole book on the threefold office of Christ, both in his exaltation and in his humiliation, and the continuance of that work of Christ in his threefold office today. And so, really great book, really approachable, really easy read, but really, really powerful stuff. What the humiliation and exaltation of Jesus means for us. Man of Sorrows, King of Glory by Jonty Rhodes. That will help you understand a little bit better the threefold office of Christ. All that said, question 21, what offices does Christ execute as our Redeemer? And the answer, Christ as our Redeemer executes the offices of a prophet, of a priest, and of a king, both in his state of humiliation and exaltation. All right, just to wrap things up here, I always end with a book review. I already mentioned one book. Make sure you grab that, but I'm going to mention one more. This is Revelation 4 Views by Steve Gregg. So one of my favorite quotes, by the way, from G.K. Chesterton goes something along the lines of, John in his Revelation describes many monsters and beasts, and none so horrifying as his commentators. That's really great. Yeah, and so anyway, the reason why I'm recommending this book, I know that maybe this would be most interesting to pastors if you're a pastor and you're listening, but I think all people should read it. All Christians should read it as a helpful guide to the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation quotes the Old Testament 1.25 times per verse, right? And so it's quoting the Old Testament more than once per verse in the book of Revelation. And so when people, a lot of times when people get saved, one of the first things they want to do is turn to the book of Revelation. And that's the first place they want to go. But there's a lot of background work that you need to do in understanding the scriptures before you get to the book of Revelation, in my opinion. I think it's very, very, very important to establish a foundation in the scriptures, a deep knowledge of the Old and New Testament, before you try to head into the deep minds of the book of Revelation. If you do it the other way around and just go straight to the book of Revelation, you have no idea what John is referencing, you have no idea what the context is, and so you can just start drawing wild conclusions all over the place. But let's say you have a good foundation in the scriptures, Revelation confuses you though. This is a great book for that. No matter who you are, if you are seeking to interpret the book of Revelation, you are typically going to take one of these four views on any particular passage. So what are the four views? Well, the four views are historicist, preterist, futurist, and idealist. Let me kind of explain that real quick. The historicist interpretation of the book of Revelation would say that whenever the book of Revelation describes something, it's describing something that occurred over the course of the last 2,000 years of history. And so you might see a particular figure or a beast and say, that's Napoleon Bonaparte, that's the Black Plague in Europe, and these sorts of things. That's the historicist view. The preterist view would say that the book of Revelation is largely describing events that have already taken place. Most preterists, when it comes to the book of Revelation, believe that at least all the way up until Revelation 20, John is describing in apocalyptic language the events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And then, of course, you have the futurist view, where you take any particular passage in Revelation, you say, this hasn't been fulfilled yet, this is yet future. That one's the most, simple to understand, I think, in a lot of ways, but the most complicated to actually tease out. And then lastly is the idealist. The idealist view would say that this isn't necessarily describing any specific event at all. This is more describing a spiritual reality of, the war between Satan and the church and is just putting it in apocalyptic language. That's the idealist view. Now, no matter what position you take on the end times, your position takes a spattering of these approaches. For example, a lot of dispensational guys will say that the book of Revelation has not been fulfilled. It's yet future. It's in the future. So they take the futurist approach to the book of Revelation. But in the early chapters of the book of Revelation, they actually say that the letters that are to the 7 churches in those first few chapters are not necessarily specific churches that John was writing to in the first century, but are actually describing church ages across history. So you have the Philadelphian age and the Laodicean age, for example, in relation to those letters to the churches, right? That is a historicist interpretation. And so even though most of the book of Revelation, a dispensational person would say that hasn't happened yet, that is yet future, they're still going to take a historicist view of those early chapters a lot of the time. And so this happens, you're going, no matter what view you have of eschatology and the end times and the rapture and all of this stuff, when it comes to the book of Revelation, you're probably going to take a spattering of these 4 views depending on any particular passage. But what I think reading this book does is it helps you see the various ways that these verses get interpreted depending on your framework. And all of them are orthodox. All of them, you can still be a Christian and believe any of the 4 views. But it's helpful to kind of go through the different views and compare them side by side on a particular passage. And this helped me a ton. I mean, when I was in my ordination process and someone asked me a question about the end times during my ordination examination, and I was very, very transparent and honest and said, you know what, when it comes to eschatology, I don't know. I don't have my mind made up. I can see what you're saying and I can see what you're saying, but I don't know. And that's what I said when I got ordained, But since then, one of the helpful tools that helped me kind of clarify my position was reading this book, Revelation 4 Views by Steve Gregg. Pick that up. Anyway, thank you. This has been a lengthy episode, but hopefully it has been helpful to you. Thank you for listening to the PodCatechist. Visit newcatechistpress.com. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and have a great week.